So good afternoon. Thank you for coming to seminar today. I'm Brian Young. I'm officially the host, I think, for Tom today. However, this is the first I've seen him all day. So have I been doing a good job? So far? Yeah. I'm at my best when I'm not seen, I guess. Tom Jordan, wheat scientist extraordinaire. Before I got here at Purdue, I used to hear about Tom and his program and his graduate students, and it was something that you could model after. At least that's what I heard from some of the graduate students. So all good things about his weed science research and extension program. But then when I got here, Tom decided to quit for some reason. I don't know what that means. But Tom has, this bio here. He's going to talk about himself enough and introduce himself. So I probably won't go into a lot of details on that. But he has a lot of great history. So he's kind of been the historian. When I got here, he already had a slide presentation and a Word document, I think, in terms of the history of at least the extension component of weed science. And so since he's the historian, we wanted to make sure that we capture that and share for those who think, weed science is just like myself and Tommy Butts right now. It's a little bit more than that. So that's what Tom is here to do, kind of share the history of weed science, where we've been. I'm not sure if he's going to, talk about where we're going, because I don't know if I want to hear that. Okay, but Tom is not short of words. So I want to make sure we start on time. And then also there should be time for questions at the end.
Let's hope so.
All right. Well, I thank you again for attending, and Tom will give a very entertaining presentation. So Tom?
Boy, I've got to follow that. Thank you a lot for inviting me. And I want to quickly thank two people, Amy, who did yeoman's work of getting a whole bunch of archival stuff brought up for me to look at. And I really appreciate you doing that. And the other one is one of Brian's students, Emma, back here, who put the PowerPoints together for me. And not that she just did that, but she also had to listen to me, call her up all the time. No, change this one, change that one. So thank you for doing that. What I was asked to do is the history of the weed science program here in the department. And I can't squeeze 137 years into a 35-minute talk. So what I want to do is to divide that thing up into two parts. The one I'm going to talk about the most is the first from 1888 when the department started and go through the Second World War in the mid-40s. And then time permitted, we'll talk about what we've done since World War II. And that's because we had synthetic herbicides come in at that time. We had none before that. So I'd like to just kind of tell you how we got started and let you, unlike pathology or the entomology groups, you've had several, a century at least or more, of organized research. So you're having all this history to look at for modeling and whatnot. Weed science didn't start until 1950s, late 40s and 50s. So these people that were here, they were winging it. They had nothing to go on. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk to several people who were here then. And they were all here at least a decade. But in time, I'm going to give you one thing they did. They sort of built up to where we are today. And so to do that, though, and I sure hope you told me the right button on this. You have to talk a little bit about the department. Everybody pretty well knows this, but it started in 1888, and the head department was called Botanical Department at the time. And J.C. Arthur was the department head, but they called the department heads chiefs, and so he was chief of the Botanical Department. And it was a department of the experiment station. We call it Ag Research now, but it's an experiment station. It was not a department of the School of Agriculture or the soon-to-be developed Extension Department. So it was strictly a research department. We did not teach any students until 1946 in this department. So we had this long period of history where we were just a research department. In one of his reports to the university in 1890s, he said the department has been active in identifying weeds and making weed eradications recommendations since the department began. So why are we here? We've been here since the beginning. This is where they put us in this department. And essentially what they were doing then is because we were the land grant college, part of that system that had research, teaching, extension in it, people were sending letters to the department saying, I have this weed. What is it? What can I do about it? But he was getting a tremendous number of these letters coming in. So in order to answer them, he had one of the people that worked for him, William Stewart, he just said, Stewart, you're going to answer all these letters and you're going to tell them what it is and try to give them some information to control them. And he also said, if you run out of time and you have too many, this guy named Aaron Johnson can help you. That was two people that worked with Dr. Barr. Well, early in the 1990s, there was a weed out in the plains areas, out in Nebraska and that area out there, that was called Russian thistle. We know it as tumbleweed. So it was really rapid and it was moving east into the Great Lakes states. So everybody was hearing about this really bad weed. And so they started sending in weed samples. Is this Russian thistle? Well, it turns out, no, it wasn't. This is Russian thistle here, tumbleweed. It was a weed called prickly lettuce. It wasn't even in the same family. But prickly lettuce was becoming a real big problem in the state rapidly. So with the numbers of inquiries they were getting and whatnot, Dr. Arthur wrote a bulletin called Wild Prickly Lettuce. And it was a station bulletin. It was pretty thick, not like this on it. That was the first weed science publication in our department by Rush guy, right? And so that was the first weed science publication that we had in the department, was on that particular weed. Well, William Stewart resigned in 1901, and all the weed information that was coming in and questionnaires that were coming in got to be turned over to Aaron Johnson. And a few years later, they said there's more to it than this answering weeds. So you need to start kind of looking around as to what kind of problems they have in the state. They changed his title to assistant botanist at that time. And he really became the first weed scientist that we have. So in 1910, he wrote in his report, it is an important part of the work of the department to answer inquiries about weeds and stray plants. And that task was given to Aaron Johnson. And one of the reasons that it was increasing is because the Hatch Act funds were coming in from Washington to the land grant colleges, and Botany was getting part of those types of grant money, actually fund money, and he was letting the weed science group there, Johnson and some of his help, utilize it to go out into the state, look at what the problems were. Another thing that happened while he was out looking at all these problem weeds, if you're going to answer the question, go out and see the problem so you can better answer the question. He was contacted by the American Steel and Wire Company out of Illinois, and they said, hey, we will give you a sprayer, a 2-horse traction sprayer. We'll give you a sprayer and a bunch of our byproducts from this still. The main one was iron sulfate, but they had stuff like diluted sulfuric acid. They had old used motor oil, and whatnot that they were using for the equipment. And they had other kind of byproducts. And they said, try some of this on some weeds and see if they have weed control properties. So this is Aaron Johnson here in southern part of the state where there's a lot of wild garlic in that area. So they're looking at one of those products, probably the iron sulfate, to see what it would do on it. And this guy with the watermark on his elbow here, that's Dr. Arthur out with him looking at. He was very supportive of weed science. He really was. And so they're out looking at that type of demonstration. I wouldn't call it research. It was mostly just going out in fields to spray and stuff. And so he was doing that. Two changes occurred. One was the weed scientist was getting industry support to go out from state. And the other one, it was moving away from the university. Remember, this was a research department. Everybody was on campus. Nobody was moving out. But in order to spray this stuff around the state to test it, you had to go away. So weed science began to move a lot of their demonstration research off campus. And so it evolved into extension. They started kind of doing the extension work for the department. And Johnson retired or left in 1911, and they hired a guy named Frank Pipel to take his place. He was a little more methodical than Johnson, and so he wanted to do like, let's kind of do a research deal on this instead of just spraying big areas and seeing what the results was. He immediately made a potential breakthrough in wild garlic control by using that equipment. And he sprayed what he called orchard heating oil. All that was is a real higher cut of petroleum. And it's what they used to use for the smudge pots when they thought they were going to get frost. They would put those out and burn them to keep the temperature up, to keep the frost from getting on the orchard plants. So he used that, and it worked. Oh, wild garlic. So Arthur made a pretty good bit to do out of it in his reports. And he reported a new non-selective herbicide, kill vegetation. Actually, he took that data that Piper was doing, and he wrote an article, submitted it to Science, and got it published. It got published in his name, not Piper's name, but he got it published. And he said two things, and I'll take a little bit more time on this slide than usual, because he said recent studies have shown that weeds are of the first importance and not, as has been universally held, at the point of second importance in corn cultivation is removal of weeds. So what was normally been said about that was that if you cultivate your field right, you won't have weeds. All right. He said, I don't think that's right. I can't get into it, but he was, if any of you are familiar with Lehigh Bailey from Cornell, he was sort of the prelude of Leopold, or Aldo Leopold. He was the one that was saying that. And so Arthur says, no, that data now shows that weeds, if they're removed and you don't have weeds, you don't need to cultivate. And he says, this writer, which was the part published, is not aware that this subject has ever been addressed that way before. So what is he talking about? What is he talking about? Talking about no-till. No-till production. And I think it's interesting because no-till on a wide scale was not successful in our state or around the corn soybean belt until the mid 1980s early 1990s when two things happened. Genetically modified crops, Roundup Ready soybeans, and the use of Roundup on a crop. Until that time, we couldn't really do wide-scale no-till. He was aware that it could happen way back in 1912. And I thought that was kind of interesting that he thought of that. We got money into our department from a state law that said we want to put some more money into extension. This was at that bill there. And what they wanted to do is separate out the old extension component of experiment station and make it a separate department. So then now we have extension service and agricultural research service, the experiment station, if you will. And they said to carry that forward, you got to have some person in each department with an extension primary appointment. Well, that happened in 1911, but the botany department didn't do anything about it in 1914. They still didn't have the extension person that was dedicated to extension. They just had these people that were doing it and still having to do research. So 1915, Arthur stepped down as department head. He didn't really retire because he was here from about 1946 or 47. And he was essentially a emeritus professor and had all of his grad students then under him. So he retired, and it said in a report that when he retired, the entire Rush group resigned. And there were only two people left in the department. And one of them was Fred Pipel, the weed guy. They said he was doing a good job. But not only Jackson, but from that, there was hardly anything said in any of the experiment station reports up through about 1950 because all of the work was being reported in this new extension group. So that's kind of where we stood up to then. Pipel resigned and they hired a guy named Al Hansen. And Al Hansen was not noted in any of the extension articles except one in 1924. He'd been here 3 or 4 years, and all they said about him was that he's one of the faculty members and has an appointment as associate botany, and that was all that was said about him. And then nothing else was really for a long time said about anything in the agriculture experiment station reports, only in the new extension. Well, when he came on in the 20s, a couple of things happened. One, in 21 and 22, the state passed a Pure Seed Act. And they made the state chemist in charge of it to regulate having seed that did not have weeds seed in it. And they named 19 weeds that they called noxious weeds. They were really poisonous weeds that were on livestock. And they said you cannot sell any of your seed stock if they have these seeds in it. So the state chemist office started regulating that. And so Hansen divided up his responsibilities in two things. One is his organizing seed salesmen and farmers who sold seed into county schools, and he would go around and teach them to identify those 19 weed seed from the seed. You know, look at the seed and say, this is a noxious one, this is not, and to keep them out of the seeds that they sold. And the other thing is, he was still having to do weed control work. He still have to do that. And they were still getting inquiries. And he had one thing going for him that the other two didn't. And that was 2 years prior to it came on the market, a product called sodium chlorate was cleared to be used on on crops in Indiana. Now, remember, the first one, you couldn't have any crop there because it would kill it, so it's all burned down. But this one was one that was semi-translocated herbicide. You had to get it really, sometimes you had to get a lot of rain and to wash it down to the roots, but this sodium chlorate would actually control creeping perennials, get down in the root rhizome system of some of these weeds and do a fairly good job of controlling it, except the environment had to be right, you had to get the right rains, and you had to use a lot of it. A whole lot of it, okay. No EPA back then. So with that, Hansen resigned in 1930, and right before he resigned, they brought in this guy who was Oliver C. Lee, Ollie Lee, and he began his extension work in late 1929. And from 1929 to 1940, he even decided to do a more narrow scope of weed control and weed research. At that time, what was happening is people were going away from tillage by horsepower. In other words, horses pulling the tillage, which was pretty shallow tillage, and they were going to tractor power, which was a much deeper tillage system. If you take these perennial creeping weeds, if you don't get down to that root or rhizome system, they just keep growing as one big plant. So there were plenty of places in a, say, 100-acre cornfield that had maybe a 2-acre patch of Canada thistle. It was all one big plant. So you could eradicate that, and they used the term eradication a lot back then. I mean, you could pour on a lot of sodium chlorate, or you could do things like what they call smother crops. They could take sheets of paper with tar on them and lay them down and just bake them for a year. But if you cultivate it, what happens then is this. Well, okay, I'm glad I got this thing back. Okay, what happens then is they break up the root system and they scatter these things through the field. Well, when they do that, instead of having one big plant, you got a whole lot of plants scattered all through the field. So, okay, you can no longer do smother crops, or you can go out and spray all that on one big patch. You got it scattered out. So he narrowed his scope of weed control to agronomic crops. Because of that, they were expanded with cultivation with tractors. You would get larger and larger fields. And this term started calling it chemical weed control instead of weed eradication. And he did that because he knew with things like sodium chlorate, you really weren't eradicating it. You were just controlling it and suppressing it till the crops get above it. And next year, when you plant it, they were going to happen again. So you were going to control it for that season. So the term weed control started coming in, weed eradication going out in the 40s. Well, he pulled his work back from what Al Hansen was doing, which was just going out, doing a lot of demonstrations and teaching and not doing a lot of replicated research, a little bit like Piper was doing. And with these perennial weed problems, this is a case, I don't know if you can see that, but this is where they tilled, and these are all a bunch of little tiny plants, separate plants now, going through the field, moving out. So they had to do something. So they started getting corporate together. The counties, farmers would get together and they would rent these commercial sprayers. And they rented them for $1.50 per acre. And they were applying that sodium chlorate. It cost us $60 per acre to get rid of this stuff. So you only wanted to spray it on the areas that was moving, and you wanted to try to control it as much as possible. Well, in the 30s, what is that? That's the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Nobody had money, and corn prices they were probably losing money on those areas. So they they got together and went from one farm to the next, and I don't know how many pounds per acre $60 was, but it was a lot of sodium chloride. But Lee did do one thing. He moved the herbicide product. He had more herbicide products to work with because then they started doing a few other, like some photosynthetic inhibitor soil applied stuff. But he was able then to develop what we know now as basic replicated research in the field. And so he started that along with his colleagues in a couple of other states where they were actually trying to do efficacy trials on herbicides and whatnot. This is just showing, this is giant ragweed behind him, and here he is in the field looking at his results. And it probably doesn't show well with those old pictures, but from World War II now, something else happened. During World War II, both sides of the conflict were doing developing chemical warfare products. And Dow Chemical was developed 2,4-D. And when they used it, it was very good, very, very good on the control of these perennial annuals and broadleaf weeds. So that came out. And before they could get it registered, if you will, today to do that, Dow gave it around the nation the difference, and in the Midwest, they gave it to three places: Audie Lee here in Purdue, his counterpart in Iowa, and his counterpart in Missouri. So they looked at this thing and actually in depth looking at it, doing rates on the different crops and on the different weeds. And they had some others, 2,4,5-T and TCA. They didn't last long, but on the 2,4-D remains. So that's the one we're using still today. And he was doing these plots that I was telling you about, these replicated plots. And all of his field data, if you go to the archives, he has about 6 years of field data there, where he shows his randomized plots, his rates of what he was doing, when he was doing. And he was not only doing them on his research plots, but he was taking them out here to farmers' field to do a large scale look-see. So between the two of them, the data, they were then making recommendations. And 2 years after that, it was ready to go commercially, and people have been using it since. So this really began the present protocol that people like Brian still uses today to do field plot evaluations. And so he did that. So synthetic herbicides really opened up the discipline of weed science. It also started the science of weed science. And it was during this period that the society became Weed Science Society of America. The first publication of weed science was in 1951. So weed science really has a pretty short lifespan compared to the other pest disciplines who have 2 or 3 centuries of. So the efforts prior to 1950 was just, how do you get rid of it? I want to kill it, I want to eradicate it, I don't want it to come back. And now with this, we talk about chemical weed control as a way to make a crop, establish a crop, and then knowing that we're going to be putting out those same products probably next year. So Ollie's approach to weed research and extension is the model that we use. What we've done, though, we've improved a lot of stuff. We've improved the techniques, we've improved the equipment. We now do more lab work. Ollie could just look at the whole plant. We now look at cellular level, we look at the genetics of it, the whole bit. So we can do a lot more, but it still starts with and ends up with this evaluation. This is Dr. Young's field research, where he's got several replications, and he's got his treatments randomized, and I don't know what that is. I assume it's Clorox bleach that he's trying on something. I didn't get to see what it would do, but we still do that. Ollie and his peers started it, and we still take that approach. So that's where we are. That's how we got there. They started with nothing, with no knowledge, no background, and tried everything, and it kept getting better and better and better until we got synthetic herbicides, and now we've had wheat science doing what we do now. So that's who we were at Plum Extension. So who are we now? Who is Extension? Who's research? Who's teaching? And usually it's a combination of all of those. So since Ollie Lee, we've had these people. I go through them quickly. They got their picture, and I had them autograph it. For me, and Michael and Hanson and Ollie Lee.
Jim.
Now we have Jim Williams, who was here from 61 to 85, and Merrill Ross, who was here from 65 to 2005. Now these two, Jim and Merrill, knew Ollie. They overlapped him. So they had a lot. They could tell you a lot, could have told you a lot about Ollie because they were with him several years. Merrill went ahead on and left it from the extension department to teaching and research. He did research on those perennial weeds that we talked about. He and Carol Lemby wrote the textbook, undergraduate introduction to weed science textbook. That thing was used in every university and every college that taught weed science for years. And so he also became, he was made a fellow in the Weed Science Society and also got outstanding teacher in that. So he still did, his work was still more extension oriented, but he did a lot of teaching, and he taught that course until I guess Gibson and Halleck came on staff, so several years. The other one in that group was Tom Bauman. So those three did the efficacy trials. They did what the testing of new products and whatnot, making recommendations for the state. And when Merrill left, it was Tom and Jim that did that. That was me with hair. I came in 78. I came as they opened up a new position. It's called integrated pest management, weed scientist. So I worked with the entomologist and the pathologist on our programs, and we kind of catered more to the local seed people and field representatives from industry and whatnot for our extension work. Case Medlin came, he was only about a year and a half. He came to do work with application equipment. That was why he came. But he decided that Louisiana or Texas was a better fit for him, so he went there. That's when Bill Johnson came. Now, I told you I got their signatures. That's bad. But Bill was here. He's still here for several more months, I hope. And then Tommy Butts, sitting here, came. He came as our technology guy, drones and that type of thing. So that's the weed science group. Now, from Jim, Tommy, we all had split appointments, extension, research. We all carried graduate students. The only one that really taught was Merrill out of the group. So that was the group. But we did have several weed scientists that worked in extension. We had two that was here from USDA, Agricultural Research Service, kind of like Steve is back here. Mars Schreiber, Mike Hickman. How am I doing? Okay. They were here. Marv was here for several years. Mike was here for about 9. And then I assume ARS closed those positions out around, but they weren't replaced. Marvin's an interesting guy. During World War II, he was a Navy frogman. We call him SEALs now. He was an underwater demolition guy. He went up and put bombs under the German boats. And Mike was for 7 years on a nuclear submarine. His job was to keep the nuclear thing running. Then we had people in our department here. Bruce Rogers was here in the 50s, early 60s. He went on, did his career at the University of Hawaii. Richard Hull was here from the 60s to early 70s, about 71. He went on to Rhode Island. Jim Murray was here from the 60s through the 70s. He continued on at Purdue, but over in pharmaceutical sciences. And he became, from his wheat science background, he became the director of Purdue Cancer Center. And he made his name in cancer research. And he retired a few years ago. And since all these people have since died. From the, well, you know, sometimes I'll make it. From a teaching standpoint, these are teaching researchers. Fred Roth, I think, was the first one that taught the undergraduate. I can find nobody who taught that undergraduate wheat science course before him. And that was in the late 60s, very early 70s. He left and went on to Nebraska. Merrill came in, remember Merrill and Carol? I put Carol down here. She was actually the department's aquatic specialist. So she worked in aquatic, but one of the problems of aquaculture is weeds. So she was doing some weeds, but she didn't have the title of weed scientist. But you probably could put her up here with, I didn't know where to put her, but she probably be up here with Merrill because of that, working with that book. Merrill taught from here down to about right here. Dan Hess started the 600 level course over here. Mode of action of herbicides, that's still what it's called. It was in horticulture until they moved it over here with Dan. I took it under Fred Warren when I was a student in horticulture, but they moved it over here. Dan did a fantastic job of setting that course up. Then Mike Foley followed him. They both left and went elsewhere. And then that's when Steve Halleck, Bob Pruitt. I don't know. I think Bob probably wouldn't consider himself a weed scientist, but he did teach the mode of action herbicide course until Brian came along. Is that fair? Yep. And then Brian teaches, you teach both of them? Okay. Brian's doing triple duty for you. And that's the researchers. So that's who we are. That's how we got here. And it was a pretty rough start until about what, 60, 70 years ago, as long as wheat science has really been around. Oh, yes, ma'am.
If you think there are old collections of weeds that people had collected or sent in or anything, maybe Kathy.
A lot of them's in the
herbarium?
Herbarium,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Well, I'd have to ask, but yeah, you could find a lot of them in the herbarium.
Interesting, if there's evolutionary responses to the different, like to the sodium.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure that like any other species, especially when you're talking about weeds and controlling them, you're going to push one out and bring a.
Yeah, there are a lot of known. Yeah, there are a lot of known variants that are involved in like herbicide resistance. But yeah, it could be interesting to look at how those came up over time or something.
Yeah. What I've noticed, and I've I've given talks on this, is we talked about the tillage system being very shallow and whatnot, and then it got really deep, and now we go back. If you look at the weed problems they had earlier, they were one set of weeds. Then they changed when you got tillage. And when we went to no-till, those came back. If you look at what were some of the problems, they were the problems we had in the 20s with no-till. But during the tillage, we had a whole set of different problems. Has to do with the size of the weeds, seed, and whatnot, and you're turning things under. So a lot of the small grass seeds and small seeds were turned under, and a lot of the large seeded plants were up on top. So we had crazy stuff that we don't have now. I came here, Jimson weed was just really bad. You don't even hear about it anymore, and the ragweeds and that type of stuff, the broadleaf weeds were there, with big seeded, and the grass in earlier on the no-till in the 20s was crabgrass. During tillage, it was giant foxtail. In my plots, my no-till plots out at Throckmorton when I was there, and it was crabgrass again. So, and so it would come, and a lot of them respond to the tillage or the career tillage, I think. Yes, ma'am.
So we've got a couple questions online. The first one back to the list of names, right? Where does Dan Childs fit in?
Dan Childs was not a professor. He was, I think he was Carroll's graduate student.
Right, extension program specialist.
And he was a professional in extension. So I was just getting the fact that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Dan was good. He was here for several years and did quite a good job. Yes.
And I've got another question. Nick, if you want to try to unmute yourself, you can ask.
There.
Probably left.
Hey, Tom, good to see you. When you brought up Dan Hess, it reminded me that Purdue played a good role, a significant role in herbicide mode of action, the basic research of mode of action. And that all changed with glyphosate. I wondered if you could comment on how the field changed from going from understanding mode of action to design new specific herbicides to the kind of the molecular age that gave us glyphosate resistant plants.
Oh, well, yeah. Glyphosate, when it first came out, was great as long as you didn't have a crop around. It would kill everything, okay? And that's how they used it, but they only used it either before or after crop was out in the fall or before the crop was in the spring, or they used it. I had developed with a ag engineer, I had developed a little sprayer that had a shield on it, and you could go spray it under the crop after it was up. When it's maybe this tall, you could get under and spray and shield it with those sprayers. So it was not affecting the crop. It was just it was killing those weeds, but you could only use it mostly with some other, when it wasn't in the crop, because it was pretty dangerous on the crop. But once they developed the resistance to it and put that gene in, they stopped using every herbicide imaginable. To raise a crop of corn or soybeans, you had to have at least 3 different herbicides, sort applied, earth post, something like that. But you needed multiple herbicides. And the cost was pretty high. So in the 1970s, you may be paying $25, $28 an acre for weed control. I got that from the ag economist. I didn't just dream it up. The ag economist told me that. Then they developed this resistance to Roundup. They planted it where you could spray Roundup over it now for $3 an acre and pretty well control all the weeds. Well, that felt so good that they said 25, 28 versus 3. I think I'll take the 3. They did it every year, corn, soybeans, a whole bit. Yeah. And that's the only thing they used. Well, the weed was always there. And then you got resistance. I forgot what the first one was. I think it was some kind of grass, but now they got everything. You got your giant ragweed, I think, is resistant to it, and all these weeds. So what happened is that it was overused. Anytime you keep putting the same stress on anything, you're going to wind up either killing it or getting it resistant, and that's what happened. So the genetics did change things. Now, it's just between us, but Bauman, Williams, Ross, and Jordan kept telling Monsanto, who had it, you're going to get resistance if you keep using it. And they, oh, no, it takes 27 different combinations of genes to make it resistant. Well, it took one gene. One gene made it resistant. And so they got it. Well, we weren't the only ones. Everybody that at universities were telling them, you're going to do it, overdo it, and he's going to get resistant. But the same thing happened to several of the herbicides. I don't know them anymore, but you got resistance to several of them because they were overused. So yeah, the rotation of them would keep it down. But that, Dick, is the best I can tell you. It was just they overused the darn thing and they got natural resistance. I don't know that it's necessary. It may have changed the genetics of the weed, but it could be that you just had a population of those weeds that had that mutated gene in the first place, but they were suppressed by the rest of them. And you get them out, they're gonna multiply. So that's the best I could tell you.
Yeah, I always wondered from the very beginning why they didn't take the advice of pathologists to find multiple independent resistance to a disease organism to do the same thing for herbicides, and that is have 2 herbicides with completely independent modes of action and engineer double resistance in the crop plants.
Don't know. I had retired by then. But maybe Brian Young could tell you, but I do not know why they haven't. I can't tell you. In fact, there are some plants that are resistant to more than one herbicide now. So Mother Nature knows how to do it very well. But I can't tell you that. I'm sorry.
When did Ollie Lee retire?
Ollie Lee retired he died in 68 on a job, some heart attack. But so he was here for 29 to
I vaguely remember when I came, and I came in 68, so
he was
maybe I did him in.
been you, but he was here a long time. He was probably the longest here. Jim Williams knew him very well. He laughed. He said, all they always like to do is research in the morning because he'd like to go play golf. So I didn't know him. I was here, didn't come here until 78. So I didn't really know him. I heard a lot about him. Well, I thank all of you for coming. I hope. Yes. Back here.
When did the federal government start regulating herbicides, and what was the trigger for that? Was it
When did they start regulating it?
When, yeah,
They had regulated, we didn't have an EPA to 72, okay? So it was the Department of Agriculture and the whatever food, whatever you got now, whatever that, they would regulate it even back then. But they didn't, they actually depended on like the university telling them, was it any good? Or they just talked to the chemical companies and they told them it was okay. But yeah, they had it back then, but the real big good regulations came with EPA. Now, EPA started in 72 and I think they agree with me. They didn't know what they were doing until about 79, 80. They got really, they were just getting organized. And so they were making all kinds of crazy statements and doing things, you know, you got to do this, you got to do that you couldn't do. But they did not have enough agricultural background people in their department. They hired environmentalists who had read Silent Springs. And so they were basing, honestly, I'm being true. They'll tell you that, you know. And so they had too many of those in. I was telling the graduate students today, they were telling you all these things you had to do. Like if you're going to put out, you're going to put herbicide in it through irrigation, and you're going to move the irrigation pipe around to put it out. You have to have Tyvek suits, you have to have rubber boots, rubber gloves up to your, you know, you have to have goggles and bright wind cap. Well, if you're out in a field where you're irrigating in August, where I came from in Mississippi, it's about 115 out there with all that water and humidity. It's pretty hard to convince somebody that's going to pick up these heavy things with water in them and move them that you got to put that on. And one of the things that the Delta Council, which was a big organization of the Delta counties in Mississippi, invited EPA down to Stover Research Center, where I was, and said, we want you to come down here and we'll talk. You'd like to talk and talk these things over. Well, they got some of the farmers there and they said, we'll let you go out on the farm and see it. Well, they suited them all up and all this stuff and let them move the irrigation pipes in August. And, you know, and so they started, okay, we understand. And I showed them the spray equipment, which they were making recommendations of what nozzle you needed to have and how you could apply it and what rate. And I showed them the equipment, put it out, and they said, oh, that's what a direct sprayer is. I've never seen one before, you know? So yeah, they were disorganized. They're doing a pretty good job now. And they have been since the 80s. But yeah, it was a little rough start to get the pesticide industry and researchers to really go along with what they were doing. And now, when I was working here, you know, at Wheat Science, I used to actually meet and have Region 5 EPA out of Chicago come in and look at our stuff. And it was good. I'd go there and meet with them. They'd come here. So yeah, I think it works a lot better than that. And doesn't matter. It wasn't the best. But so good regulation got started in the early 70s with the EPA, yeah. Good. Thank you a lot.